Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this lunch discussion and what I expect to be a very lively panel on a new and provocative idea, linking savings and cash transfers for the poor in developing countries. My name is Jamie Zimmerman, and I direct the Global Assets Program here at the New America Foundation. I wanted to welcome you all here today and let you know that this concept was born out of a relatively simple hypothesis that we could improve the efficiency of anti-poverty efforts by enabling financial inclusion of cash transfer beneficiaries around the world. And these beneficiaries tend to be the poorest of the poor, often called the bottom billion. And that we could also then improve their effectiveness by leveraging behavioral insights that we've found on conditional cash transfers and elsewhere to encourage savings behavior and asset building over time. So we posited that these two priorities, social protection on the one hand and financial inclusion and asset building on the other hand, could actually be mutually reinforcing if they were more explicitly linked. So to explore this hypothesis, together with the Ford Foundation, Citi Foundation, the United Nations Development Program, and Proyecto Capital, Fundación Capital, and our Global Assets Project here at New America, we came together at the end of in November of 2010, late last year, brought together a select group of folks, about 100 leading practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and funders from both the financial inclusion and the social protection fields at the Ford Foundation in New York to creatively and constructively debate and explore this potential for savings-linked conditional cash transfers as a high-leverage tool that could accelerate progress towards poverty reduction. So we're here today, all of us, to publicly launch the outcomes of that closed-door meeting and through this report, which there are many stacks of outside. So if you don't have one already, please pick it up at some point before you go. And I wanted to share with all of you the lessons, challenges, and new ideas that came out of that meeting, and some of our ideas for a path forward for this exciting new area of work. We have a pretty packed agenda for you all today, and I wanted to just run through it really quickly to give you a sense of how we're going to break this down. So we're going to start with a keynote from one of the founding fathers of not only this concept, but of asset building at large, Frank DiGiovanni of the Ford Foundation, and I'll introduce him properly in just a moment. And then next we'll bring up a panel of expert commentators from government to funders to the private sector who will give us their perspective on this concept and how it might relate to their own ongoing work. And then we'll open the floor to your questions and before the end of the session, and we'll end this afternoon with comments from yet another one of the founding fathers and a vocal champion of these ideas, Henry Jacklin of the UNDP, who I'll also introduce properly later. And so I'll be here to moderate this discussion and all of the movement throughout. And just want to make a quick logistical note before we begin, because I always forget to do this later, so I'll do it now while I'm looking actually at talking points, that the event is webcast live on the internet, so globally. So during Q&A, when you ask questions to the panelists, please wait for the microphone, speak directly into the microphone, and introduce yourself so that those of our colleagues who are watching remotely are able to enjoy the entirety of the discussion. So now I have the honor of introducing Frank DiGiovanni, who will give today's keynote. Frank is the director of financial assets at the Ford Foundation. He leads Ford's worldwide efforts to build financial assets for disadvantaged people through grants focused on different sets of initiatives on savings, individual asset development, social security reform, rural livelihood development, and consumer financial services. Frank has been with the Ford Foundation since, can I say, 1991? It's a nice long tenure. And before that, he was an associate professor and senior research associate at the New School for Social Research in New York City, where he researched and taught graduate level courses in housing, community development, urban political economy, and policy analysis. And even before that, he was with the Pratt Institute's Department of City and Regional Planning in Brooklyn, where he consulted on projects in housing and community development. So when I say he's a founding father of these topics, I am not joking. And he has been a really amazing supporter, an active supporter of this particular concept. And I want to take this opportunity that I have at the podium to thank him for all of his support over the last couple of years as we've been developing these ideas. So Frank, thank you, and come on up. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. I don't know if being called a founding father is a compliment or something else. I guess it's the gray hair and the lack of hair, too. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, and this is a topic that is, for me, really close to my heart and one that is actually very exciting. So I'm going to talk about a few things. One, just to provide some background on conditional cash transfer programs, what they are, why we think they're effective, and then talk about why we think linking them to savings accounts will make them even more effective, and talk a bit about what the Ford Foundation is doing to promote that idea, and then ending by talking about some of the major questions that are sort of unresolved, and then turn it over to the panel. So I think it will surprise no one to say that poverty and inequality remain fundamental challenges in many developing countries in the world today, that more than 1 billion people globally live below the poverty line of $1.25 per day per person. In recent years, more than 30 governments worldwide have developed innovative efforts called conditional cash transfer programs to address the needs of these poorest families. And for the rest of my remarks, I'm just going to shorten the name of these programs to the acronym CCTs. These programs originated in Latin America. They started actually in Mexico with the Progressive program, and they're being replicated now in Africa, Latin, and Asia, and in unusual places like New York City. In Latin America, more than 25 million families alone benefit from these programs. These programs provide money, typically between $30 and $200, depending on the size of the family and the characteristics of the country. They provide this money directly to families via a social contract. And typically the contract requires the children to attend school and visit a health center on a regular basis. For extremely poor families, this cash provides emergency assistance and ensures a minimum level of consumption, while the conditions also promote long-term investments in the human capital of the children. CCTs have been recognized as an effective anti-poverty social protection mechanism with important short-term and long-term benefits. In the short term, they improve consumption for the families, typically in the form of food. In the long term, they improve the human capital, typically for the children, thus helping to break intergenerational transmission of poverty for the families. But as promising as these programs are, they suffer from two important shortcomings. First, most of the programs do not connect the beneficiaries to mainstream financial systems. Less than 25% of the cash transfer programs worldwide are not linked to bank accounts. This is a lost opportunity to promote financial inclusion for millions of families. The second shortcoming of conditional cash transfer programs is that they are not designed to help parents increase their assets over the medium term, the next two decades of their lives. Conditional cash transfer programs do not produce lasting improvements in the capacity of their parents to accumulate assets, to build economic security, and to escape poverty. The most direct beneficiaries of the programs, and typically these are women in the households, remain dependent on the continued availability of the transfer and are unable to invest in opportunities for the future. This is a critical issue because years of work on poverty demonstrate that what truly separates the poorest families from the more prosperous families is not just income but assets. Assets, whether it's human capital, financial capital, or physical capital, make it possible for families to weather tough times and to seize opportunities to lead to economic security. I think now many of us recognize that we have a transformational opportunity to take conditional cash transfer programs to the next level by addressing these two shortcomings. This can be done by using these programs to promote financial inclusion and by incorporating savings incentives into the programs to promote asset building by the beneficiaries. Enhancing conditional cash transfer programs in this way would enable them to meet two critical needs of poor families. The first is access to a safe and secure place to save and access to other much-needed financial services such as remittances. Years of experience in the microfinance field, and there are many of us in this room who've had that experience, have taught us that poor families have a great demand for savings. In fact, in many ways, poor families have a greater demand for savings than they have for credit. And the importance of financial inclusion is increasingly being recognized by the G20, the World Bank, the UN system, and many other donors as a critical need for families. And the second opportunity is for families, is for the adults in these families to save and to build their own human and financial assets, allowing them to move toward economic security. Building this enhanced approach to CCTs can be transformational for the families and a win-win opportunity both for governments and for the financial institutions. So let's look at how it's transformational for families. Having a bank account has both short-term and long-term benefits for the families. In the most immediate sense, having a bank account can save the clients of these programs significant hours that they now spend waiting in line to get cash from the pay points. Many families, especially those in rural areas, often have to travel hours just to get to a pay point, and then they have to wait in line hours just to get the cash from the pay points. Having a bank account will save them significant amounts of time. And then having a savings account will allow families to smooth consumption across lean seasons. This is particularly important for rural families who often have no source of income for 3 to 4 months a year after the harvest has come in and they've basically used up all of their crops. And it also helps protect families against emergencies. In the long term, having savings accounts helps build human capital, such as self-esteem, negotiating skills, empowerment, and often political participation. And this is especially important for the women beneficiaries who often get greater control of the money by having it in the bank accounts where their husbands often cannot get access to it. And secondly, it facilitates accumulation of savings and often the acquisition of productive assets such as livestock and equipment. Our vision is that as families build savings, they can pursue opportunities that would not have been possible through cash transfers alone, such as establishing a credit history, gaining access to other financial services such as money transfers and insurance, and investing in a small business, improving a home, and saving for education. And governments hopefully can benefit in a number of ways as well. They can experience improved effectiveness of the program. As the families benefit from these programs, the impact of the CCT program itself will become, I think, enhanced, more effective. The governments will experience improved efficiency for their programs as they experience lower operating costs by converting the distribution of cash through bank accounts rather than through these pay points. And finally, there's a possibility that the governments will experience lower cost overall, with the possibility that families may be able to graduate from the programs. And finally, financial institutions may benefit through fee income from the savings accounts, through the opportunity to cross-sell other financial services as families become banked. And finally, they may be able to fulfill corporate social responsibility needs as the families are banked. Let me now provide some examples of how the Ford Foundation is pursuing this vision. We are working with 13 countries in Latin America to encourage them to redesign and improve their public policies involving financial inclusion and social protection. The specific objective of this work is to encourage these governments to incorporate savings accounts into their conditional cash transfer programs. We are also working with the government of South Africa to design a pilot project to incorporate savings into their large cash grant program for children that now serves 11 million children. Let me focus the rest of my remarks on our work in Latin America. Our grantee, Proyecto Capital, has signed agreements with 6 governments to design pilot projects to incorporate savings accounts into their conditional cash transfer projects. These countries are Peru, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic. Collectively, these countries serve 9 million families in their conditional cash transfer programs. I'm now going to give you examples of 2 of the countries where these pilots are underway. So in Peru, we're now in the second phase of the program, serving 24,000 households in the Juntos program in 26 districts. In this program, Juntos deposits the conditional cash transfer payments into bank accounts in the state bank. At the end of each quarter, women who have positive balances in the account at the end of the quarter are eligible to participate in a lottery of food baskets worth between $10 and $15 a month. Surprisingly, this sounds a little unusual. Why would a food basket be an incentive? But interestingly, it is proving to be an incentive for the women to save. And so at the end of this quarter, if they have a positive balance, there's a drawing in the public square in each of the districts, and the women who have positive balances, as I said, are eligible to acquire the food basket. The pilot is being evaluated to see what impact the incentive has on their savings behavior. And the goal, if the pilot is successful, is to roll out this program to all 450,000 Juntos clients. The precursor to this pilot, which operated for 4 years, indicated that very poor women could save. The women in this pilot had incomes between $1.50 and $2.50 a day. And over the course of the 4 years, they saved $250. And $180 of this was their own money. $70 came from, in this case, it was a cash match. But it showed us that very poor women, almost all of these were indigenous women who had never been in a bank at any point in their life, showed us that, in fact, very poor women were able to save with the encouragement of a match. The second country where the pilot is underway is in Colombia. The pilot currently is serving 40,000 beneficiaries. The conditional cash payment is again deposited into the state bank. At every 2 months, clients with positive balances are eligible for a lottery where the prize, in this case, is a cash award equal to 5 times the balance in their savings account. Just as in Peru, the government is financing the savings incentive. In this case, financial education also is being provided. The pilot is being evaluated using a randomized controlled trial and with 3 interventions being tested: the financial education alone, the financial incentive alone, and the combination of the financial incentive and the financial education. The next phase of the project, which should start in January, will involve 300,000 households. And the goal in this is to roll out, if successful, to roll out the pilot to all 2.5 million participants in Colombia's program. One additional interesting development is that our grantee is designing a graduation pilot with the Colombia government to explore how to work with clients to assist them in developing livelihoods to help them graduate from the program. So in conclusion, I have presented one vision of how enhancing conditional cash transfer programs by using them to promote financial inclusion and savings by very poor families has the potential to transform the clients' lives while benefiting the government and financial institutions. But it is important to recognize that this vision is a strong belief, or as social scientists would say, a strong hypothesis. And we have to be careful about not promising that enhanced conditional cash transfer programs can deliver outcomes that are not achievable. That is why we are testing and evaluating this vision with pilots in a number of countries. Many questions remain unanswered about key components of the vision. For example, how much can or will families save? What types of incentives are most effective? Will they use their savings to acquire productive assets? Will converting conditional cash transfer operations to accounts improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the programs? Will savings accounts be financially feasible for financial institutions to provide? How can emerging technologies like mobile banking, cell phones, SMS messages be integrated into these programs? Can conditional cash transfer recipients graduate from programs if they are enhanced with bank accounts and the incentives to save? Are financial incentives feasible for countries to provide? Can financial education be provided at scale? These are all questions for which we lack answers, and we hope that the experimentation we're underwriting can provide some of these answers. The report that Jamie held up identifies a number of these questions and many other ones that we've identified in the course of the November colloquium. And I guess I'll end by saying, despite these unresolved issues, we think that the growing convergence between the financial inclusion field and the social protection field is very promising and will lead to exciting opportunities for those of us in the field to work together in crafting solutions to help very poor families improve their economic security. So I thank you for the opportunity to address you today, and we look forward to hearing the panel and then answering questions from you later. Thanks again.
Okay, don't be shy. Let's go. All right, we're going to now begin a lively discussion amongst the panel. And I'm actually going to sit. So following on to, are these on? Can everybody hear me? Is it projecting? Okay, great. So following on to Frank's vision that he laid out and the case that he made for the promise that there may be in this idea of linking savings and conditional cash transfers. I wanted to bring together a diverse group of experts who've been working in and maybe even straddling these two fields already for some time to react and tell us what they think about it. So with that, I will introduce our panel, and then I have a number of questions that I am burning to ask right now. So we'll start to my immediate right, Shari Berenbach. Shari is the director of the Microenterprise Development Office at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Her career in microfinance and international banking spans more than 3 decades, if you can believe that. I love doing that. I don't know. That's the thing. Because it's impressive, not because, So she is a pioneer of the impact investing field and served as president and CEO of the Calvert Foundation, a nonprofit financial intermediary that mobilizes capital for social investors to meet critical financing needs in affordable housing, microfinance, fair trade, and other essential community services. Her microfinance work began long ago when she served as the program director. Now it's just funny too. Okay, for partnership, program director for Partnership for Productivity International. And throughout the 80s, Shari worked with microfinance operations in more than 24 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And even before that, she was with the IFC, where she worked for with the business advisory services for Latin America and the Caribbean. She's had many stints in the private sector with Solomon Brothers, Citigroup, a telecommunications startup. So deep within the microfinance and international banking and private sector world. Next, to her right is Alberto Chaya, who is a partner at McKinsey & Company in the Mexico City office and the central member of their financial inclusion team there. He joined McKinsey in 2002, and since his joining has been working with low-income mortgage providers and other financial institutions that are servicing low-income clients. He was the co-leader of McKinsey's Financial Inclusion Knowledge Initiative, as well as serving on several economic development-related projects throughout Latin America. All of his client work has focused on areas of strategy and growth, and predominantly in the energy and financial sectors in Latin America, Korea, and Spain. Has been working in the microfinance field since the mid-90s. To his right is Selwyn Jahoma, who's the Deputy Director General of Comprehensive Social Security for the Government of South Africa. Selwyn has turned his department's attention to the reform of the entire social security system, with a particular focus on the retirement system for the entire country. He became the Director for Social Insurance in the National Department of Social Development in October of 2000. And his initial task was the development of an overall service delivery improvement strategy for the social grants system. The strategy focused on two components: norms and standards for services and the replacement of the information and technology systems. And he became the chief director of the grant system in 2001 and responsible for the development of a blueprint for establishing the South African Social Security Agency, quite a mandate. And to his right is Fermin Vivanco, an investment officer within the Multilateral Investment Fund of the Inter-American Development Bank. Fermin has more than 15 years of experience in microfinance and is a team leader for investments, loans, and technical assistance projects for what they call the MIF, the Multilateral Investment Fund. His portfolio is concentrated in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Honduras, Colombia, and Ecuador, and includes projects that foster social entrepreneurship and financial services for low-income people and rural populations, small agro producers as well. Many of the projects involve credit unions, community development organizations, and financial intermediaries, all aimed at serving the underserved populations. And currently he directs the program Technologies for Financial Inclusion. And so very appropriate to have you here today. So thank you so much to the four of you for joining us. I would like to start by asking a couple broad questions to the four of you. First, I think the way that I'll begin this is all of you are in some way or are thinking about beginning to work on this issue of savings-linked conditional cash transfers or financial inclusion and government-to-person payments, if we look at this maybe a little bit more broadly. I would love for each of you to take an opportunity to share with the audience today where you're working at the moment or where you're interested in working. Give us a little bit of flavor of what you're doing on this topic right now.
Should I jump in?
Sure, please.
Yes.
We'll start
Okay,
with
great.
Frank.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie, and thanks everyone for being here, and thank you, Frank, for your opening comments. I think that they really set the stage for us in many ways. USAID, or I should really speak more broadly in terms of the U.S. government, is very interested in this whole area of financial inclusions, the conditional cash transfers, and in particular there's a strong interest in seeing ways that we can use new technologies to create greater efficiencies in how we can deliver these services and deliver these resources to many who are currently unbanked or outside the financial mainstream. I mean, specifically Administrator Shaw and Secretary Clinton have both emphasized this importance of these innovative technologies as sort of a key to unlock solutions of long-held challenges. As we know, as we talk about providing these financial transfers and ultimately to link them to some kind of savings mechanism, it really requires reaching the very, very, very most vulnerable populations that historically have not been banked, certainly by conventional banks, but even many of the MFIs do not reach down to those very vulnerable populations. So we really think that technology is going to be an important part to see how we can unlock this this opportunity and really help the funding to flow. USAID is identifying at this time about a half dozen countries where we're specifically taking a deep dive and helping to try and define specific strategies that would be appropriate for those environments, and we really think that CCTs will become is really a very ripe avenue for us to be working further.
Thank you, Jamie. We started working in Mexico with the Oportunidades program 3 years ago on trying to find ways in which solve the problem that Frank was describing in the distribution of the cash payments to the beneficiaries. Oportunidades, as many of you know, was the first program, the first conditional cash transfer program, a very successful program in many ways, but had not been able to solve the issue of how they were distributing the cash.
Here.
No, no.
Could you speak a little
More closer.
Is this better? Okay, thank you. So we identified a possibility of using a huge network of community-owned stores in Mexico called Diconsa. They have 23,000 stores in communities under 2,500 people. This used to be a network that was established by the Mexican government in the 1960s, 1970s to promote food distribution in these communities, but that now has transformed into more mom-and-pop shops. So they're very small shops in probably half of the communities where they operate. They're the only store in town, and they serve both a social mission of having food at decent prices, and also as part of a community development effort by the Mexican government. They have always focused on distributing food. We thought it was a tremendous possibility of using the stores to distribute financial services. After making some numbers, we discovered that around 80% of the Oportunidades payroll was composed of people that were living within 3 kilometers of those stores. So this completely changed the possibilities of how cash was to be distributed. 3 years later, what we have is 5,000 of those 23,000 stores distributing the program. We have about 1.7 million families receiving their benefits using smart cards with biometric identification. 600,000 of those in the stores, 1.1 million using ATMs and other distribution methods. And we have the possibility of grow this program to the full 5.5 million payroll of Oportunidades by the end of this year. So it has had a tremendous impact in a relatively short period of time. I'm also working in Ethiopia with the similar program, trying to use networks of microfinance institutions to replicate what we did in Mexico.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Jamie. I think I probably need to start by indicating that our, call it, democracy project in South Africa is fairly young. In fact, we celebrated 17 years of freedom just last week. And of course, with that celebration comes an assessment of how far the country has come since 1994. Of course, having made the assessment in 1994, it was very clear that South Africa suffered, as many other countries, severe social backlogs, and somehow government had to address the multidimensional nature of poverty. An area in which I am happy to say South Africa has made progress amongst, of course, the other many areas, is the extension of social security, and in this case specifically child support, or what you would call child allowance grants. In fact, in 1994, when we had our first democratic election, only 7% of the population qualified, or because of race-based arrangements, qualified for Social Security. Today, we're happy to say that 30% of the population access Social Security and are eligible for it. And of course, in addition to that, government started to address the issues of housing backlogs, access to water, access to sanitation, electrification, etc. By last year and this is what South Africa did, we introduced the child support grant for, in this case, of course, unfortunately, we've got to always refer to our race-based arrangements for non-white children since 1997. And since then, we have grown the grant by about 1 million children into the system from, in the main, poor households or households with no income. Last year, we reached the last age cohort where children at the age or under the age of 18 could qualify for it. So the invitation to myself and my Director General last year was quite fortuitous because we were looking at what's the next phase in our, call it, nation-building project in terms of addressing poverty. And the idea of conditional cash transfers linked with savings arrangements immediately appealed to us. I should say it is a powerful idea and an idea whose time has come. One of the failures of the system in the last 13 to 14 years of rolling it out is that many people receive their cash transfers at pay points outside of the mainstream banking, and naturally something like that does not bode well for social cohesion, because you have your poor on one side and your middle class and rich entering the banking system. In addition to that, just providing the cash transfers took up over 3.5% of our of the entire budget, which is a very significant budget by developing country standards. And so, having had the discussion with the representatives here, we immediately felt that this should be considered in South Africa. Of course, with or at least after conversation with our colleagues from New Africa Foundation, the Ford Foundation, we immediately started the idea of a concept, which is now translated into a high-level framework and plan in which we are looking at South Africans over the next 2 to 3 years to migrate most of our social grants beneficiaries to banking institutions, thereby reducing the cost of our operations, but also as Giovanni pointed out, it would be part of government's more medium and long-term plan to build the asset base of poor, to take them to the next level. So we're pretty excited about it. Thank you.
Thank you. I will start with a comment about Frank on how for low-income people savings is more important than credit, and I think that's kind of the starting point for the MIF in this matter. And what we have seen we work at the Multilateral Investment Fund, we work mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we have found that only 10% of the low-income people actually do have bank accounts or do save formally, but most low-income people save informally or in cash. And our starting point is there. And what we have realized is that our work in the past was mostly with microfinance institutions, but mostly with credit, with loans. But for very low-income people, loans is not an option. If you have a larger expenditure or you have an emergency, you have to repair your house, you have to pay for the school expenses, you have to either take some assets, sell your assets, or get a loan from a loan shark. So we realize that it really increases the vulnerability of low-income people not having access to savings. So that was kind of our starting point, and we come across the conditional cash transfer programs, which are also supported by the Inter-American Development Bank, of which the Multilateral Investment Fund is part. And we realized that these programs have a huge scale and in many cases good targeting for low-income people. So there was, as Frank said, a huge opportunity for financial inclusion, linking savings to conditional cash transfers. Our approach is that the savings products have to make sense for the household. We are actually supporting financial intermediaries to develop savings products that make sense for low-income people. In this sense, our approach, I think, is a little bit complementary of what is usually discussed in this type of events, because in the events usually you're talking about conditional cash transfer programs design and making changes to the design of conditional cash transfer to enable savings. But our approach is to work with financial intermediaries that are familiar with low-income population, that have a relation with low-income population, also with financial intermediaries that are already doing conditional cash transfers. But our hypothesis is that the savings product have to make sense for the family. And what I mean by that is that savings and the amount of savings is not a function only of the conditional cash transfer amount, but of the whole household income. And conditional cash transfers are important, but they are not the only source of income. Usually, in Latin America, I think in the country where the average amount is bigger as a percentage of the total household income is Mexico, which is 20%. In most other countries, is under 20%. So you have to take that into consideration. And also, it's important to recognize what are the purposes of savings. Savings usually are for safety or convenience, the liquidity savings, the basic savings accounts, and also for long-term investments or emergencies. So the products have to make sense for the beneficiaries. And with that perspective in mind, with the support of Citi Foundation as well, we have a regional program to promote the development of savings products for low-income people that are recipients of CCTs. And this is a $6.6 million program, and it's focused more on two types of projects, either pilots that want to demonstrate the business case to offer savings to recipients of CCTs, or expansions of particular existing savings programs. And the institutions that are eligible for this support are either financial intermediaries, either public agencies doing CCTs, or financial inclusion agencies. But at the end, we really want to work with financial intermediaries as they are the ones that are to be offering the savings products. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks to all of you. Make sure I'm speaking in the microphone. I thought it would be useful just for everyone to have a sense of the diversity of ways in which these very different sectoral perspectives are approaching this concept, because I think that it can take many different forms, and what it means really depends on who you're talking to. And so I think that that's a useful way to start fueling this debate. Frank, in his keynote, outlined at the very end a rather long list of questions that are yet to be answered, from the business case to client demand issues to impact issues, technology issues, and so on. I would love to hear from each of you what you think are, from either your personal perspective or the perch in which you sit institutionally, are still the biggest questions that remain to be answered for this concept.
I'll go in and jump in, because I was one of the ones that went to Jamie as we were planning this session and said, Jamie, I have a lot of different ideas about this subject. And that is that, to me, the conditional cash transfers are just the beginning. And that, this small amounts of cash that really does meet some of the very most pressing needs for these households and families is very, very important. But it's really just the first step. My office the USAID Microenterprise Office collaborated with the Ford Foundation and CGAP in something that was called the graduation model. And with that, there was really looking at how do you begin to weave together the cash transfers that you would see as part of a CCT with a package of other services, so that it includes some social engagement and sort of self-empowerment that kind of touches upon financial literacy, but really builds kind of a level of confidence for the participants. It then gets involved with livelihoods, identifying livelihoods, and ultimately with linking people to markets. Because as we, I think, all understand, cash really is very, very important, and savings are a very important part of household needs. But cash alone is not going to create the kind of really changing and transforming the opportunities for these populations. And so while I welcome the CCTs, and I think they're very, very important, I see them as a first step. I'm very happy to see them being linked with the savings and the recognition how important asset building is. But I'd like to think that this is a trajectory, and that the cash transfers are just the beginning of a multifaceted approach that we would need to be thinking about if we really want to see people moving forward.
To me, there is a very clear case of why this makes sense for everybody involved. I very much agree with what Frank was saying at the beginning. We made estimations in Mexico where we saw that people were spending between 5 and 20% of the money that they were receiving on the day of the disbursement in transaction costs, in transportation, food, the opportunity cost of not working that day. Sometimes they have to leave food for the husband that is left in the town. Kids were not going to school that day, and that's 6 times a year. And they were losing, as I said, between 5 and 20% of what they were receiving in that single day. So when you consider the amount of resources that countries are putting into this, that this is being lost instead of being part of the productive environment that CCTs are designed for, is just tremendous. So if you start with that and you consider the amount of money that governments are already spending in distributing envelopes with cash in different parts, you can very clearly make the business case for an intervention for making an electronic distribution of these payments. Our estimations show that if you move a program like Oportunidades to an electronic distribution, without considering all the benefits that Frank was outlining from savings, just the pure money that will be saved to the system can be 70 in present value, could be 70 times the money that you will need to set up the system. So it's very, very clear that you can use the existing money being distributed and paid to institutions that are making they're distributing the envelopes with cash to make this work and to make this work in a way that will enable other financial services to be offered. The case for private sector intervention is also very clear. Those are customers that are very difficult to reach for a financial institution. So banks will have a very hard time trying to find ways to interact with single customers and to make them part of their business. But if you can work with a conditional cash transfer program that has 500,000, 2 million, 5 million families that are already identified, that you know that they will be receiving a payment with certain periodicity, etc., you can really make a product that will work for these people. You can start with savings, but you can move also to other products that will sense also for financial institutions. So I think that the opportunity that is there with the conditional cash transfer is something that could benefit the public, the private, and the social sector tremendously. We have to leverage everything that governments have invested in creating these programs, in identifying people, in collecting their basic information to make it work for all participants.
Yeah. Thanks. I think I'll pick up on my colleagues' comments. Immediately, if we were able to move all our beneficiaries for social grants to the formal financial institutions, the banks, and have them access accounts, be it plain debit orders or order arrangements or savings accounts, we could, in 5 years' time, save $1 billion. That is a lot of money that could go to the poor. Now, up to now, there's been challenges, but that's sort of in a sense on the operational side of saving. But I think our focus, probably for the most part, Jamie, is on how we can leverage these opportunities to enhance the building of human capital. Now, as South Africa's social grant system grew, and this is a debate that America has had for many decades, but by early 2003, the arguments of this is a waste on the fiscus and increasing welfare dependency, and all sorts of, I dare say, again, America, I know they had its fair share of claims about the poor having more children than they should have, etc. We conducted or commissioned studies, and the studies proved conclusively to most detractors, but of course to unbelievers never, that poverty in South Africa was reduced by about 5%. It's been the government's most successful poverty intervention program post-1994, that people with income support or family allowances were able to better access health care, education, that inequality in the country, regrettably, it's still amongst the highest in the world, but in the absence of the grants, our inequality or Gini coefficient would be much higher. So the case has been made for cash transfers, while, of course, government addresses other more sticky problems and challenges of industrialization and unemployment, etc. What we would want to see and explore in this exercise is the extent to which, if we provide people with an additional amount, and how much that should be, for putting away in a savings account for 3 to 4 years, to what extent we could then help them transition from, and again, and I will continue to say it in inverted commas, a dependency on just the income support to other opportunities of economic activity, be it micro enterprises on their own, be it better education, and be it employment. Now, in an environment where the economy, although it is growing but it's not generating jobs, it definitely will be a challenge. But we would want to embark on that way, and particularly we would want to focus on young people aged 16 to 18 and say years a part of the grant. If you save a part of what you are getting and government complements it, you will be rewarded. And then how can that money help you to enter into either employment or self-employment or whatever the case may be?
Okay. Well, I will focus on the financial inclusion aspect, and I would say that I think the CCTs provide a huge opportunity for financial inclusion, or for low-income people to open bank accounts, and I think one of the keys for success will be to recognize that it's not only having the opportunity to save which will make this successful, but developing the products and that will make sense for the low-income people, because what we have seen is that most savings for low-income people are informal, in cash or in assets, and it's key that that the products are attractive for low-income people. And one of the components I would say that is critical, and the CCT programs could play a role, is financial education. It's a term that has been used in many ways and sometimes with ambiguity, but I would say that all products have to have a component of financial education, and the promotion of these products should be financial education. And you have many experiences with the self-help groups or the group savings and the village banking, where if you have groups of people with the incentives to save and that actually see how the savings can provide some of the benefits that Frank has mentioned, the self-reliance and satisfaction and community sense. That type of elements are critical to include if you really want to be successful with the savings program. Otherwise, people would use the savings account just to access the money, and they will actually use the whole amount of the CCT.
Great, thank you. Well, I'd like to move into some specific questions that I have for each of you, if I may. I'll start down at the end because you've been going last the last 2 times, so now I'll just switch the order a little bit. Fermin, in Alberto's comments, he mentioned the opportunity that these CCT programs offer of millions of identified families and beneficiaries that are receiving these cash transfer payments, and how part and parcel to the business case is leveraging that group of identified beneficiaries for the banks. But in your program, you discussed that there may not necessarily be an explicit linkage, a direct deposit of, it's not an explicit linkage to of the cash transfers into accounts themselves, but maybe products that those beneficiaries might use. Do you think that you might be missing an opportunity by not working more closely with the transfers themselves?
Well, our experience with programs that work with the same population, and these are savings or with credit unions or with community organizations, is that in towns, not all low-income people are receiving CCTs, and that's for a fact. And recently, I was in Colombia, and I visited several departments, and you saw in some small towns, you see that the program is not functioning because the database has not been updated, and you find that maybe a person or a mother when the child already finishes school, no longer qualifies, and it's the work. I mean, the world doesn't finish in the CCT program. It's low-income people are in rural areas, in urban areas, and it's if you work exclusively with the CCT programs and you actually try to introduce in the design of the CCT programs these features, I think it might be more complicated than working with financial intermediaries that develop products for low-income people, and then the CCT recipients use those products. You have in Latin America some examples of success with micro savings, and I'm sure that if you are a CCT recipient and you see that there is a financial intermediary that offers you a better savings product next door, you are going to move your money to that financial intermediary, and you're not going to keep it in the public bank or in the institution that is giving you the cash transfer. So in a sense, we are not denying that the CCT programs should enable savings, but we think that it's important that complementary approach, that you have to work in the environment, you have to be able to promote a savings product that work for low-income people regardless of being CCT recipients or not.
Alberto, would you like to comment on that?
I completely agree with Fermin that the world doesn't end with CCTs. Clearly, there are a lot of opportunities, but at the same time, I think that using CCTs and all the expenditure that governments are already putting into this is some sort of cross-subsidy to incentivize the participation of others into the distribution of financial services or other services. I think that when you consider the amount of money that is being distributed in those communities, even if only half of that town is receiving a CCT, that will incentivize a financial institution to open shop in that community. It will benefit everybody in the community, and they will probably never move into those communities if they were not distributing the CCTs. I think I'm not trying to propose that CCTs should be the basis for all development policies, but I think that you have to leverage the money that you're already spending as a country to try to move private and public institutions into doing other things. I mean, and the savings, I mean, the kind of savings that we're hearing from South Africa or the ones that we are seeing in Mexico can be used to improve the livelihood of recipients of CCTs. I mean, you can increase the amount that they are receiving, but you can also provide other services like life insurance. So maybe with the savings that you can achieve by moving to an electronic distribution system, you can provide life insurance to all the beneficiaries, which is something that they have never had. And this is also enabled by the fact that now you have electronic distribution that will make easier to make both collections and payments to a life insurance scheme. It could be provided by the government. It could be provided by private institutions that could work out of this electronic distribution. So I think it opens up a lot of possibilities once you have a system of electronically distributing those programs, and it's open not only to the recipients of the program, but to everyone in those communities. I think it's a tremendous opportunity to move public and private financial institutions to communities that are currently not being served with probably a branchless banking model.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just to comment very
Sure.
briefly. Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, that's in the ideal world. If you have a public bank that is distributing CCTs and at the same time has the capacity and the experience and the infrastructure or the ability to develop those products or savings, that would be ideal, because then in that case you leverage that huge number of CCT recipients that can actually get financial inclusion. But in fact, that is not happening so far. I mean, so far, maybe Mexico is one exception, but you don't have financial intermediaries focused on low-income people doing CCT transfers. So I'm not sure. I mean, and this is what we want to support, but so far they haven't been able to provide those financial products for low-income people successfully.
Yeah, thanks. There are many different ways in which you could approach this, it seems, and that's an interesting debate to have. I'm going to turn now to Selwyn. And I actually have a couple of different questions for you, Selwyn. The first is you started to tell us a little bit about the ideas you have for the longer-term asset building tool that you'd like to create through the child allowance. I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit more about what you have planned or what you'd like to see happen with that, what the intended impacts might be and how you're planning to study those. But then there's another question I have for you, stemming from our conversations yesterday, is that bank fees, the cost of banking in South Africa is among the highest in the world, definitely in Africa, and that also, and which obviously is a barrier for very low-income beneficiaries to use financial services, and couple that with a suspicion of financial institutions among the same target population. I'm wondering how those considerations have impacted what you're developing, and whether you're getting pushback from others within the country or within the government on encouraging savings at all, and how you're trying to grapple with that particular problem.
Yeah, thanks again, Jamie. I must be honest, the way we look at it is that this policy shift, presents a number of opportunities. At the end of the day, of course, as the policy process goes, there's going to have to be a give and take in the process, and then probably saying let's achieve 2 or 3 of the many objectives. Just to mention another 2 of those that I have not mentioned, South Africa's got a very high level of school registration and attendance. And hence, we never really had a debate around conditional benefits until the last 2 years when we moved to the high age cohorts, because then we started giving benefits to children who could legally access or enter the labor market. It was then felt by the government, but we faced the risk of young people being employed as well as getting the benefit. Hence, the legal requirement for all of them to attend school. But our school attendance has always been at the rate of about 98%, and therefore the debate around conditionality of the benefit has not been around. But what, however, is a challenge is that the dropout rates in the higher grades of schooling is exceptionally high, and quite often amongst boys. It used to be many years ago amongst the girl child. Girl children, since the grants have been introduced, have better school attendance rates and higher completion rates. So what we would want to achieve, in addition to ensuring that we give the income support, that we could potentially say, here is an additional savings account, but you will qualify for it for grant. So that perhaps would be the conditionality of it. But also there's the issue of additional financial services. Accessing insurance in South Africa, amongst our many anomalies as a country, has a very strong private sector arrangement for all social insurance arrangements, and very little by the state itself. I know America also has the debate around Social Security constantly. But in our case, the state always pre-94 has had a distance from it. And so giving these bank accounts will hopefully, and we're convinced, allow poor people to access insurance products in addition to just the savings arrangements. How do we intend to deal with some of the other challenges? I think out of our conversation here in America, at least in New York, when we sat down with the Ford Foundation and New Africa Foundation, is around a three-pronged strategy. One, we'll be working with bankable frontiers, and Jamie and the team was quite clever in that they invited the managing director of our banking association to the meeting, so it provided a platform for us to put a bit of pressure on him there. And he made a commitment in New York, which if it doesn't carry out, we'll definitely bring it back to you and ask for another meeting in New York. But I have no doubt it puts the spotlight on the banking sector. And yes, you're quite right. Although they want to deny it and they say we're not comparing apples with apple, but banking costs in South Africa, along also with savings for retirement, is amongst the highest in the world. And there's evidence for it. The banks have been under scrutiny. I think out of this process, they gave a commitment. And in the near future, we'll be sitting down with them and representatives from bankable frontiers based here in the States. And we'll add pressure to that along with our treasury and say, you bring the costs down and we'll transfer our beneficiaries. So that's the one approach. The other approach that we are looking at is to have a policy conversation among civil society and government. Civil society in particular are opposed to attachment of any conditionalities. I think we can bring them to the table and say, government does not want to impose conditionalities to providing the benefit, but rather give an added benefit, provided that there is both an acceptance of your right to access a benefit, but also your obligation in terms of either finishing school or searching for a job. A third element of it is really to refine the policy and go to our legislatures and see whether we can get their buy-in. It does mean initially an investment into an extended benefit. It does mean an investment in a new technology arrangement and an education process of our beneficiaries. But in that three-pronged approach, we fairly convinced that we could have a fair measure of success within the next 2 to 3 years.
Great. Wow, that is really interesting. I'm going to ask my last question before I open it up to the panel, to Shari. And it's a little bit of a doozy, but I'm wondering, from your perspective, what's the role of bilateral and multilateral donor agencies in this space? What do you think about that? And in particular, how do you think that there's potential in a concept like this for aid programming? And by that, I actually mean the aid disbursements. Sure. Yeah, that would be great.
Well, I think it's actually a great matchup with bilateral and multilateral kinds of support, and in a few ways, and let me explain further. First, one of the things that's important and exciting about these programs is their scale. These are not sort of like little one-offs that are reaching, 200, 2,000, or 10,000 people. But, the different initiatives that we've been talking about really do reach large populations. And I think that for a lot of development assistance agencies, there is that concern, how can we do something that really moves the needle? The other thing about these programs is they tend to take two kinds of partners. They need both partners in the government and they need partners in the private sector. And so once again, multilateral and bilateral agencies are well designed to work with other governmental entities because there does need to be the sort of policy framework, and there needs to be the commitment on the part of governments to introduce these programs and be committed to introducing the kind of innovations that are needed so that the programs can be executed effectively. It then gets to the other point, as I was saying, is that typically, as we've looked at certain kinds of mobile financial services operations, the private sector does become an important partner, and that is a partner either because you're looking at mobile network operators that are really providing the framework for the branchless banking, branchless financial services that you've been hearing, or you're needing a partner that would really help facilitate the payments process. And in both of those instances, there's actually kind of an important infrastructure component, financial services infrastructure that's essential. And, people will talk about the success in Kenya of M-Pesa, which is, mobile financial services. It's not the CCT, but we do know that what an important component was DFID had really made an initial grant, like a challenge grant, to the mobile network operator Vodafone to encourage them to build out their platform. USAID recently, in collaboration with Gates Foundation, had made a challenge in Haiti to a number of the mobile network operators to get them to sort of expand and build out their sort of platform. And as I've mentioned earlier, that USAID is looking at focusing on a select number of countries. And one of the things that we're thinking, very much about is the fact that there often is the need for a substantial infrastructure investment that's often done in coordination with a private sector partner. And we're going to need to think through how can development assistance be brought to bear to help facilitate that kind of it's not bricks and mortars any longer, but it is, in effect, the piping of the payment in functional transactions that can allow us to see the more efficient delivery of the cash payments and therefore the link as well to savings and ultimately other financial services.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you. So I think we'll move now to... Wonderful. I didn't even finish my sentence. Frank, would you like to come up and join the panel, please? And I'll stand from the podium. Thanks, Jane.
Wow. Even get my own name tag.
Yeah, really.
High class.
Just before we begin, I would like to give Frank the first opportunity to respond to any of the comments that he heard made over the last half hour or so, and then I'll call on the many of you. Anything you have to say?
No, I don't have anything.
He loved it. So let's move on. Okay, I'll start here in the front, and then we'll move our way back. It looks like there are a lot of questions, so please, introduce yourself, speak in the microphone, keep your question to a question, and if you can, let them know who you're directing your question to.
Questions before responding?
We could do it that way too.
Since there's so many.
Yeah, sure. Let's go with a couple of questions first then. We'll start here.
I'm Marianne Stein with the Mariah Fund, which is a private foundation.
Is it on?
It is on. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Marianne Stein with the Mariah Fund. I have a question to any of you who wants to answer it. I find it very exciting and interesting, and I understand the aspect of the savings with respect to the time, the opportunity costs, and responding to emergencies and smoothing things out. What's not so clear to me is the moving out of poverty. How much can these people save and in what context do they then have the wherewithal to have the productive capacity that will allow them to move out of poverty? And to what extent have you all explored that? Because it would seem to me that would be a pretty critical question to have at least some sense of how it gets answered before you invest too much money in putting this forward as the way out of poverty.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go here. And then who else did
My name is Jane Pratt. I'm a development practitioner who's turned evaluator of development programs. We know from microfinance that it's been tremendously successful in initiating new investments and in getting a high rate of return. What we also know about microfinance is that it has been much less it is continuing to be dependent on grant money for technical assistance. It is not self-sustaining. So my question is, one, how do you make this new CCT and socially inclusive financing, how do you make that profitable for banks? Or is it going to be continually dependent on grant support? And since we're also in the middle of a period where we're experiencing banks behaving badly, how do you ensure that when millions of poor people are putting their savings and entrusting them to these financial institutions, how do you ensure that the banks continue to behave responsibly?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Jed Schilling, also with a lot of experience in development and chairman of the Millennium Institute. And partly my questions have been posed, but I think it's important to emphasize that in expanding the financial linkage to CCTs, it's important that the financial infrastructure be in place. Otherwise, you effectively double the costs of the people who have to go to the bank to collect money out of their savings when they need it, and assuming they still need to buy food and other things with part of their regular payments, they have to go somewhere to collect it, either the bank or the collection agency. So that financial infrastructure needs to be in place and needs to be supported by proper regulation of the banks to make sure that they are not extracting excessive fees or other things that eliminate the very low level of savings. And just one comment on promoting the investments and things. I think a parallel activity needs to address private property rights in many of these countries, which is a major factor in discouraging investment among the poor people who have no way of assuring that they own their own land or can own their own little businesses that they're starting up.
Okay, great. So that'll be this round. I think that the way I'm going to suggest we go about this is that Frank and Selwyn say maybe a little bit of something on the actual progress out of poverty and what the vision is for how that actually is might envision that happening. I would love for Fermin for you to tackle the question of self-sustaining and the business case issues around profitability for banks. Shari, I would love for you to touch on the safety of savings and some just initial thoughts on that. And then lastly, Alberto, if you could talk a little bit about these infrastructure issues and how you have been overcoming some of those issues in Ethiopia and Mexico through agent and branchless models.
Excuse me. The question on how much can people save is a critical question and an important question. The evidence that I cited earlier about the sort of pre-pilot in Peru indicated that over 4 years the women were able to save about $180 on their own over the 4-year period. These were women who were below the poverty line. So that's about the best indication. This is not, again, in the CCT program, but the women were pretty comparable to the women in the Juntos program. I've been to Peru now 5 or 6 times over the last 3 years, and I visited this project, and I visited the people in the Juntos program. So they're pretty comparable. That's a reasonable guess as to what women in the Juntos program would be able to save. Is that enough to move out of poverty? No. So I think one of the critical issues that the research will help us identify is what savings rates look like with different kinds of incentives. Clearly, the issue of moving out of poverty is a longer-term question. You're not going to do it over 4 years. I frankly think if you compare this to microfinance, women who are participating in microfinance programs are not moving out of poverty in 4 years either. In fact, the latest research in the randomized controlled trials that are being done in microfinance is showing, I think very disappointingly, that microfinance is less robust an anti-poverty strategy than many of us thought that it would be. But the question is an important one, and I think for me, the movement out of poverty is a generational question and not a question in the short run. But I think increasingly, I mean, Shari mentioned this graduation pilot that we're doing, supporting this in 9 countries, and frankly, the women are much poorer in this graduation pilot than in many of these CCT programs, and there we're finding that women are able to save as well. So this is what we're going to learn over I think, through this research.
Do you have things in place to be actually gathering more data on the concrete results for people?
Well, now we have, as I said, in each of the pilots that we're supporting in Latin America, we have research underway. Some of them are randomized controlled trials with control groups. Others are not randomized controlled trials, but they have control groups. If we are able to do this pilot in South Africa, we will have, it will be in the end probably a randomized controlled trial as well. So yes, we will have evaluations in place. Will they go out, the 10 years or so you may need to answer this question in the most robust way? That's going to be a resource issue, so I can't promise that. But this is the critical question, and so we're going to do our best to provide answers to it.
Thank you, Frank. Selwyn, do you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, no, I think in the first place the question is that, Marianne, it's a very important question, and it's an issue that South Africa is grappling with. Given that the social safety net is so big in the country, it's proven to have been the most effective way, but it's definitely not the way that the government would want to proceed to address poverty. Government would want to see people get education, get employment, and not be reliant on the system. But I think there's some interesting evidence, and the one thing that we have and we needed to develop over the last 10 years was a good impact evaluation structure and arrangement and expertise in the area. The evidence already is telling us a couple of things. One, the birth rates among young girls have dropped quite significantly as more households have an income and able to sustain the girl child in school for a longer period of time, and they are able to get on to university. And this significant drop in the birth rate amongst teenagers have only started post-1994. Very encouraging evidence there. Again, we looked at households who get social grants, compare them with households who should be getting it, but they're not getting it as a result of some constraints. 25% more people in households who get the grants actually either move from a rural area or urban area, go out there and find work. Again, very encouraging. And I think it's intuitively a fact that if we were to increase the benefit level, which we don't really want to do, but if we were to do it, it would probably give more members in households income to be able to engage into work activities. Significant number of women in rural areas engage in micro enterprises. Again, an issue there. So that's what some of the evidence is indicating to us, and it's there, and we can share some of the papers. What are some of the other challenges? What are the constraints to people? And I think probably the one thing we need to bear in mind that about 3.5 million out of 15 million of our beneficiaries are elderly and disabled people. They'll never enter the labor market. 6 million of them are caregivers of children, and those are probably the people that, and 80% unemployed, that we would want to help to migrate or transition, and whose path we would want to ratchet up to get out of poverty. I agree with Frank, it's going to take a generation, but I think the evidence in South Africa is very encouraging. We need to do 2 things. We need to address the supply side of labor issues. That's 1. 2, we need to address the constraints of people to enter the labor market. What are the constraints? Skills, lack of skills development, and somehow we need to link this with the skills development. Secondly, just pure access to information for graduates about the availability of a job and how to get to a job. Again, we are convinced that with a savings component, we'd be able to say to people, once your benefit level ends at 18, there's a savings element that should enable you to overcome some of the constraints. To what extent we will do it is something that's definitely going to be subject to research, but there is a business case to be made for it.
Thank you. Fermin, would you like to take up business case issues?
Yes. That's
The mic, please. Thanks.
yeah. It's a key question. I think one of the initial obstacles for this business case to make savings self-sustainable for CCT recipients is that, at least in Latin America, the public banks or the institutions involved in the CCTs, in disbursing the CCTs, actually saw the government as the client. They didn't see the CCT recipients as clients, so they didn't have products or an approach or a business plan to offer savings products sustainable. But I think that has been changing, and Frank mentioned the pilot in Colombia that is being supported by the Ford Foundation, and is actually helping Banco Agrario, which is a public bank, to see the CCT recipients as clients. And I think that's the first step. Another thing that I foresee happening is that these banks will learn from microfinance or from financial intermediaries that are offering micro savings products to low-income people sustainably. For example, in the design of products, commitment savings or contractual savings, this type of savings that are long-term, have very low operational costs because every month you just save an amount that you cannot withdraw until you reach a certain commitment amount or certain date. There are this type of design that are sustainable for institutions to offer. Also, I think they will learn from cross-selling, how to offer the recipients, the CCT recipients, other financial products such as loans, which is something that some public banks will do, offer loans, or financial intermediaries offering savings to CCT recipients. Also, I think it will play, technology and branchless banking will also play a role, because if you use the traditional banking infrastructure to serve low-income people, because of the average savings amount will be very expensive. But if you use point-of-sale technologies, or you use retail networks or branchless banking networks, that will also help. And finally, I think it's important that the design really is realistic and it makes sense for both the client and for the institution. For example, we have seen that in the beginning, some of these institutions were offering unlimited withdrawals without any fees, but that's very expensive. If you limit, I don't know, 3 or 4 withdrawals per month, and if you have certain incentives for people to be efficient in the use of the savings account, that will also help self-sustainably. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Let's turn to Alberto, because as Fermin touched on, there are some infrastructure and technology issues that make the business case a little clearer, but there are also impacts on the cost to the beneficiaries or the users of the accounts themselves. It'd be great if you could talk about that.
Sure. Recently wrote a paper with Jonathan Murdoch from the Financial Access Initiative about the number of working adults that... Is this working? Yeah, sorry. That were without access to financial services. We estimated that half the world is unbanked. And I think the use of CCTs is an opportunity to leapfrog the traditional banking model and move directly into a branchless banking model that will allow to reduce some of the restrictions that Fermin was talking about. So if you can move directly to a mobile world, when mobiles are available where recipients of CCT people live, which in Mexico is not the case, by the way, but in other places like South Africa is the case. You can reduce significantly the transaction cost of doing banking with people that will have low balances and probably a normal number of transactions that will not be profitable under a normal banking model. But if you move to a branchless banking, either using correspondents, small stores, mom and pop stores in the communities where people live, or mobile banking, you can reduce significantly the cost of serving these CCT recipients. And at the same time, you might be providing higher quality products to them in a sustainable way. What we're doing in Mexico is exactly that. So we have the fortune of having a national savings bank that actually has a mission of going to those communities and trying to create saving accounts for these individuals as our instrument. But it doesn't have to be. So the numbers show that if you can create correspondence or mobile banking options for CCT recipients, the cost is very low. So if you're trying to serve those customers using branch, yes, it's almost impossible to have something like this. If you can move them to smart cards, to mobile phones, to these kind of new instruments that technology is allowing us to use now, I think it's a completely different game and something that could change the way that financial services for the poor is perceived. One of my clients at the Consa used to say that we were bringing James Bond technology to these small communities, and he's exactly right. So we're bringing biometric identification, we're bringing satellite telecommunications, we're bringing smart cards, some things that I know people in Mexico City do not have access to. But this is what is required to make a model like this happen, to make it very secure, that you're making sure that the people that are supposed to receive their money are receiving their money, and you're checking that with biometric identification, that you're offering them a very cheap way to access financial services through a POS and a smart card, and that ideally, again, this is not in Mexico, but in other countries it can be done, ideally they can use mobile phones that they're already using. We did some work with the GSMA, the Association of Telecommunications, where we estimated that there is about 1.2 billion more people in the world that have a mobile rather than a savings account. So just by counting those people that are already having those instruments, and many of them are CCT recipients, you can think of different models. So in a traditional banking model, this will not work. You will have to go to a branchless banking to make those people profitable.
Shari, any quick word on safety, concerns over safety of savings?
Needless to say, whenever you're talking about mobilizing savings of the most vulnerable populations, that making sure those savings are safe are a paramount concern, particularly of any bilateral, multilateral agencies. And I do want to just pick up, I was glad that you made reference to the unique identifying ID systems, because often one of the things that accompanies these kinds of CCT programs is these biometric identification cards, so that you are in fact able to verify that the right person is getting the payment. On one hand, it also facilitates the whole banking of customers to make sure that there's all those know your customer rules, and so that really helps facilitate from a banking standpoint. One of the things that's going on is a whole initiative on the regulatory front to figure out the appropriate kinds of regulations for these correspondent arrangements or branchless, the branchless banking, the agent networks, and because there really is a great concern to make sure that the appropriate protocols are adopted. And it's a real tricky balance, because on the one hand you don't want to encumber too much these outlets, but on the other hand you want to make sure that whatever cash deposits are in fact under the broader umbrella of the depositor insurance frameworks, and that those cash deposits are being safe kept. So it is certainly, we have one of the members of my team, Maria Stevens, is really a regulatory expert, and we're really very much working with a number of different regulatory initiatives. I might mention that, and Frank, you guys support AFI, do you not? Or there is
okay, I guess CGAP or Gates Foundation and CGAP have both been working with something called the Alliance for Financial Inclusion that's based out of Bangkok. And this is literally an alliance of bank regulators that have all come together to look at how do we create open regulatory frameworks that can, in fact, support financial inclusion and make sure that, at the very least, we're doing no harm. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's take another one, I think just one last round, so I'm not going to be able to get to everybody. Let's start over here. And then we'll go you, okay, and Monique will be the last one. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Joyce Little. I'm with Operation Hope. I want to thank the panel. But I have a quick question. Is this just for global initiatives, or is this also for America? Actually, Washington, D.C. is what I'm more interested in, because there are a couple of things I had some comments on. For example, the conditions. For example, earned income tax credit. If you have over $3,100 in unearned income, investments basically, you don't qualify for earned income tax credit. And so, like, we have an E-Trade series. So if I tell somebody you need to invest, you may want to be interested in investing in bonds or anything like that, they're not going to do it because their earned income tax credit will be cut as a result of that. So what I'm trying to find out about, although we're talking about poverty programs, we need to also talk about some of the legislation that actually keeps people in poverty. And I really do want to know, is this available in Washington, D.C.? Thank you.
Okay, great. We're going to come up front here, Anjana.
Thanks. My name is Bill Maddox. I'm from the Carsey Institute at the University of New Hampshire. And globally, there's around 4 million participants in informal savings groups, ROSCAs and ASCAs, another 80 million in self-help groups in India. And I'm just wondering, what is the role that you see for informal savings groups in conditional cash transfers, and what are some of the obstacles in terms of linking the informal with this more formal way?
Okay, we're here just behind him.
My name is Anna Fortero. I work at the World Bank. And so two quick things. First, I would make a difference between bancarization and incentivizing savings. There are two different things. Mm-hmm. And then regarding the incentivizing saving, somehow, with saving, you want, it's optimal for consumption smoothing and maybe to gather collateral for some investment, productive investment. On the other hand, CCTs are meant to reduce current poverty, which means, increasing consumption. So somehow the two things might not be, aligned, especially when you consider CCTs that have a wide range of individuals from extreme poor to like moderate poor. So I would say that probably, one needs really to assess what are the trade-offs, especially for the extreme poor, if you are to incentivize savings. And then you should really differentiate the kind of, incentives that you want to give to the different beneficiaries of the program.
Okay, and Monique. Sorry, here. I'm sorry.
Monique Cohen, Microfinance Opportunities. I'm very excited to hear that we're going to leapfrog our poor people who get CCTs into the branchless banking system. I think that's a very exciting prospect. But it's one kind of a leapfrog that I approach with caution. So I would be interested in your comments. And I'm going to give 3 examples to illustrate my point. We work with poor rural women who have just gotten smart cards on which they're supposed to save. And we're looking at financial education to help them do this. But it's quite staggering to find out that they haven't figured out that the cards are for savings. They think they're only ID cards, and yet the card entitles them to save in a bank account. We're doing some research in Kenya with M-Pesa, and we find that very few people hold money in their M-Pesa accounts. That most people clean out their accounts, about 80% clean out their accounts every single day. So how are we going to get them to save on those accounts?
Okay, great. I think that if you don't mind, then maybe we could take just one more. Hand is up. Go ahead.
I'm Steve Schafferman with the U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network. And in the interest of social inclusion and minimizing transaction costs, I'm wondering what you think about following the example of Brazil, which has more experience with CCTs than any other country. And Brazil, in the last few years, has declared its intention to move toward unconditional cash transfers. They have passed a law declaring that everyone has a right to a minimum income, and President Dilma Rousseff has announced that she's fully in support of this. So what about the idea of moving away from conditionality and toward more universal programs?
Okay, great. Okay, so how are we going to tackle these? How about, I'm looking at my long list here. Frank, can you talk about the issue of asset limits that was brought up in the first one, and if you have anything to say about the trade-offs between enabling versus encouraging savings and the types of incentives, that would be great as well. I would like perhaps for Fermin to touch on informal versus formal savings, and maybe the pros and cons of different approaches and how that might look. And maybe Selwyn, if you have something to say about that as well, because I know there's a robust informal savings system within South Africa. And Shari and Alberto, if you could say something about the leapfrogging issue and the cautions around leapfrogging and what you've seen maybe from your own experiences on the ability for the poor to understand and use these types of new technologies. And then if anyone has, we'll maybe go through an initial kind of a final word along on the panel after that. So whoever wants to start. Oh, and let me go ahead and say yes, in DC there actually has been a CCT pilot with the Department of Education, and I can give you some information about that. But that's so.
I guess I can start. I mean, yes, you're right. Asset limits are a critical issue in the U.S. I mean, thankfully, they're becoming less of a problem than they were even 5 years ago because a number of organizations have been working on this. So many states are removing asset limits. Some of them are doing this for, very specifically for individual programs. Other states are doing it more generically. But certainly the Center for Law and Social Policy is an organization you should contact around this because they've been working on this for some time. But it certainly is an issue that prevents low-income people who are beneficiaries of programs like food stamps and almost any other program from saving. So it is an issue, but as I said, many states, I think the food stamp program, I forget what it's now been renamed, but it is the most recent program to have waived, I think, many of the asset limits. So yes, it's a problem. In terms of the points you made, yes, we recognize that there is a difference between what you call bankerization and encouraging savings. In fact, one of the report that Jamie held up, was a long discussion in there about the difference, between just facilitating savings and encouraging it. And we recognize this, and I think the vision that I laid out is one that really emphasizes encouraging savings, because I think in the end, just facilitating it may not in the end make it happen. And I think we recognize, certainly in the work that we're promoting in Latin America, one of the real challenges and issues that our grantee has really had to address in working with the governments is this concern on the part of the professionals in the CCT program that encouraging savings in the end would reduce the consumption levels of the families. There's a notion that, if you encourage savings, are you in fact discouraging families from consuming? And isn't this the purpose of the conditional cash transfer programs? And I think we believe that in fact encouraging families to save may in fact promote better consumption because as I said earlier, if you encourage families to save, you help them manage their liquidity, and you in fact help them acquire money in the short run that they can use to smooth consumption in difficult periods. I mean, certainly from the experience that we have in all the countries where we operate working with rural families, if they don't save money in the flush times during the year after they've harvested their crops, if they don't have money left for the 3 to 4 months when they have no income coming in, they have a really difficult time surviving the lean period. So we think that saving, in effect, helps them when they, it's for many rural families, it's boom or bust. They get a lot of money in after the harvest, and then they have no money coming in for many months. And so savings, in fact, may very well help them smooth that consumption. So I don't think there is a huge trade-off, but it is a perception, and it does require a lot of thinking through.
And I'll just real briefly talk about, the issue of financial literacy and client education. And Monique, you raised some very good points, and you probably could well be sitting up here talking about the importance that it's not just a matter of making these tools available, but it really, particularly with the populations that we're talking about reaching, there is a need for a broader education and engagement and involvement so that people can, in fact, use the full complement of services and capacities that are embedded in whatever tool it might be. So if it's an ID card, is that also a smart card that allows savings or not? We often find, in households, parents are relying on their youngsters to help them navigate some of the new technologies. So yes, that is a big challenge, and it is an important part of what it's going to take to roll these programs out and for them to be successful. So a lot of need for financial education and work in this area.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's tremendously important. It's very difficult to try to educate people into the use of new technologies, especially some that are completely alien to them. But at the same time, when you make it very, very easy for them to understand what they are doing, for example, we're talking to some of the beneficiaries saying you used to spend 100 pesos to go to the cash point before to get your money. Leave 50 of those 100 pesos in your savings account now that you're receiving your money in the store that is next to you. That slowly starts building the habit of saving. So we went through a full financial education program with them and stuff like that, and we found these kind of very easy rules of thumbs was a lot more effective than going through the full education. I think that as long as we can provide means of saving that are secure, accessible to them, that they feel that they can go and withdraw their money at any time, people start trusting the system more and more, and that's what we're trying to provide with these mobile and branchless banking solutions. It's not always easy. Sometimes work in remote areas will create problems, but people understand more than what thing they understand. I think that part of how CCTs are designed actually requires to have this kind of secure means of storing your money. For example, in Mexico, in July, they received money to buy school supplies that they will have to use in September. So what do people do, what do families do with that money if they receive it in July and they will have to buy the supplies in September? They need somewhere to put that money. I remember one woman that the first time that we make payments in her community, we were paying her with a 500 peso bill, which is like $40. And I said, you want me to change this for you? And she said, no. I want this one bill so I can put it in my house and store it for later. I mean, there's a clear need to provide both a transactional way to interact with the financial system and a savings account that could be maybe smaller over time to build their assets. So I think that in both cases, these new technologies would allow you to do this, and that's why I think it's so important to promote them.
Yeah, no, I think the question around informality is an important point, and South Africa certainly has had a long tradition, but I think one needs to understand where that tradition comes from, informality, and I can only really assume that at the level of people viewing the banks as institutions that's either not for them, but on the other end, it's in part because of market failure. If people feel that the amount of money that they put in the bank is going to be reduced instead of being safe, just because they pay high transaction costs, then certainly for them an informal arrangement is better. We also need to understand that even informal arrangements puts the cost on individuals in the scheme. So in having these considerations in South Africa, we've had to ask ourselves, the banks have for long been an exclusive domain for certain income people when informal arrangements have kept people safe. And how do we now? Do we just kill them off? And I think we've had a conversation amongst cooperatives, informal banking conversations. And one of the things that have come out of it, clearly there's acknowledgement by the banks that their costs have been too high. And they have slowly begun to develop either products for low-income people or to reduce it. Of course, it has had to go along with some coercion by civil society and government. But there's an acknowledgement that it had to come down. The second part was an agreement that the informal institutions nevertheless be linked to the formal financial institutions, and when they bring that funds as a collective, that they be rewarded appropriately in terms of interest rates on it. But I think it's a conversation that will continue. I think what we have seen in South Africa is a slow move by low-income people to the formal financial institutions while maintaining some of these informal arrangements. And I suppose for some of them it may just because it provides a fallback situation. Jamie, if you wish, there's a question or two that we haven't responded to earlier, so while I'm at it, I may as well go for it. I think there was a question around the behavior of banks. If my memory serves me correctly, the naughtiest banks were in the USA. So in part, I think there's that acknowledgement, and I think out of conversations in the IMF, the G20, and others, there's been an agreement on better regulatory arrangements other than Basel II. And in fact, South African banks who have behaved themselves well, they came out about fourth or fifth amongst banks, especially at the end of or at least towards the end of the lowest level of the recession. But nevertheless, South African banks now also have had to be put under a review, and a discussion around a Twin Peaks model is under discussion in South Africa, where the Reserve Bank will look at the prudential side, and another institution called the Financial Services Board will look at the market behavior of banks. But nevertheless, it is an important element, and we need to look at that, given the risks that especially low-income people would be taking. There was another question around the sense of, I think, security that investors would need to follow. I think in South Africa, I must acknowledge maybe the sense of security that many people have gained has been going up and down because we've had lively debates. We remain a constitutional state, and so far, in spite of all the noises from people on the one, call it the extreme of the one side and the other side, that those risks, none of them have occurred, and we don't think they will occur. But I think it is only right that investors put their money where they have a sense of guarantee of it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Fermin, the last word on the panel is yours.
Okay. I agree pretty much with Celine on how to approach the informal savings groups. I think they provide so many lessons about how low-income people can save. So in addition to trying to connect them to the formal sector in a way that the funds that if you have some excess of funds in the group, you put those excess of funds on a regulated financial institution. In addition to that, I think those informal savings groups, which are very successful, as you said, in India with the self-help groups and in many other countries, they provide so many lessons of how people will save if it's an efficient way, if they can get loans, because they can get those loans from the informal savings group, that they can make a huge effort, and it actually creates so much entrepreneurship within the group. So I think it's important to incorporate lessons from the savings group into the design of savings products for low-income people.
Okay, great. And even though you were the last word on the panel, it's not the last word of the day. But before I introduce our colleague Henry to all of you, I would like to take an opportunity to thank all of you for your contributions today and overtime on this topic. So thank you so much. And if you don't mind, just stick around. We'll just make it easier. But the last word of the day, final thoughts will be coming from Henry Jacklin, who is the director of the Private Sector Division in the Partnerships Bureau of the United Nations Development Program. Henry started his career as a banker in Brazil in 1970s, and he's very proud of his Brazilian heritage. He talks about it a lot. And it's beautiful. He in the early 1980s, he began to work on the design and implementation of financial services and private sector development for USAID, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as the UNDP. He formally joined the UNDP in 1989 and UNCDF, where he led the creation of the first microfinance portfolio. And in 2009, he was seconded to the UNDP Brazil country office and did a lot of interesting things there until he was brought on to New York as the director of the private sector division in June of that year. And I think that I met you shortly thereafter, and here we are today. So thank you so much. Final word from Henry.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. It's a tall order. After so much content for you survivors and those still online, I think the best thing I can do at a moment like this is not to go into any of the technical details, but try to put this into a broader framework. And I'm reminded in seeing my old friend Sam Daly-Harris, and Shari and I were talking about the famous Yunus, who we've all been influenced in by one way or the other. And I was recalling the first time I met him in 1983, and he had only 60,000 clients, but at that time he was a giant, because as we went around the world, we never saw anyone with that kind of institutional possibility. And I happened to hear him in a conversation saying, the way donors work with the poor, it's probably better just to throw the money outside of a helicopter and fly over them. And then over the years, with the frustration of the development industry, and I'd say that the development industry has done a lot of great things. I would not castigate us for everything that we've done. But when it comes to working with the poor or the very poor, the development industry and governments have tended to have very heavy ideas of how to do it, very expensive ideas of how to do it. And then all of a sudden, with the birth in Mexico and Brazil of a policy that's a social innovation, I think we begin to see something very different. And to me, I always put things in a three-part framework, that if we look traditionally, the way we've dealt with the poor and the poorest especially is that they are victims. I call it the victim paradigm, because they really have a zero base. We need to give them training. We need to give them technology. We need to do this. And actually, my first confrontation with Yunus, where he really didn't like me because I was A, a consultant, and B, working for the World Bank, two of his favorite enemies, he says, you guys always want to do, just give them a loan. They know what to do. Now, in that little statement that he made, he was representing the revolution that Acción and Brack and Abid and all these others were teaching us, that instead of this victim paradigm where we have to do the training and we have to do this and we have to do that, look at the client paradigm. Give them the ability. Give them the ability to do the business that they do on their own terms. And then with that, we began to understand the household. We began to understand the household being like a micro-conglomerate. And I devised one of the first interview processes whereby people could go into these poor households to figure out the cash flow. And even though the cash flow was minimal, it was very complex, because in a year, if you look at how many things a household will do, it really is not that easy, and even though they're minuscule amounts, it's a very complex thing. So it begins to give you the idea that there is something that we've never really understood sufficiently at the base of the pyramid. We've never really understood the dynamic properly. So with that, we have a client paradigm, and I'm a fanatic not only because I have a citizenship, but I have been witness in Brazil to what I would call a transformation, a revolution, in part, not only because of, in part because of Bolsa Escola and then Bolsa Familia. Most people think it was Lula who invented it, but it was actually Fernando Henrique Cardoso and Cristóvão, as our friend there who knows Brazil well also knows. But what they've done is that they have created a means by which, with the condition, and those who are asking, what is the condition thing? What does that do? What we've learned in Brazil, and when I was seconded to Brazil, by fate, destiny, accident, whatever, I was with the Caixa Econômica, who, with UNDP, we were doing a project together. And the Caixa is the financial agent of the Bolsa Escola, now Bolsa Familia. And with them, I learned what was going on at the grassroots because of this. And the funny thing was, the first thing that happened with a woman, because it was all on the ATM card, is they said, my God, this is something for rich people. I've never seen a card like this. I can use the card. And they said, oh, they won't be able to do the PIN. You know, that was the big thing. Can illiterate women deal with the PIN? Well, they found ways of dealing with the PIN, and usually it was the kid that would help the mother or something of that nature. And then over time, and it's funny to just digress and say, why did they invent this program? They invented this program because in Brazil, everybody gets what they call a cesta básica, which is food basket. But the corruption in the creation of the food basket, the transportation of the food basket, and the distribution of the food basket meant that they were getting 40 cents on the dollar. So people said, why not just give them the money? And then 97 cents on the dollar goes to their hands these days. But that's only because, and why we are here, that there is a linkage into financial concepts, not necessarily of accounts yet, but in the evolution that can yield into an account. And then all of a sudden we see people going into what I like to call the citizenship paradigm, because when you have a contract with a mother that says it's conditional to you having your kid in school, all of a sudden it's no longer a politician giving her a basket of food expecting a vote. It is a condition to use a school that then they start saying, well, if you're making it conditional, do you know that that school doesn't work? Do you know that I won't send my kid to that school? There's never a teacher. All of a sudden you activate the demand. So in all of this, what I'm saying, to put it into a broader context, is that we are learning something that we should always know from the beginning, but we don't, is that people are just like us. Like nobody here has lived without a checking account, I assume, right? But the thing is, the world now, the poor are far more numerous than they were 40, 20, even 10 years ago, unfortunately, and they are far more monetized. So the issue of bringing resources down, underwriting minimum consumption, which is what we're talking about essentially, and even in the non-conditional, which no one here I think is against, you're talking about basically a society trying to guarantee that people have minimum consumption. And in that, as we all know through their behavior, poor women always save, and they always try to bring 1 week of funds to their beneath the mattress approach. And we're at the beginnings of developing the proper product, which in my view is best seen first as a storage concept before you get to the savings ideas. And in that, we are developing a new way of dealing, which was invented in the South, that we're learning in the North, and I think will, I believe, be a revolution greater than what we learned in the microcredit revolution. Because if we are able to do this with the technology and the leapfrogging of technology, what was born in Latin America, there is no reason why it cannot be extensive in Africa, and it's beginning to happen in Africa. But let me put a huge word of caution. If these programs do not transfer funds through electronic means and some form of basic account, they are the worst programs to have in the world. So don't just go out saying, so that's another reason why we're here. It's not just that it's a nice, good idea, fantastic, and I very much respect and appreciate Ford, that's always been a pioneer in this area, for the serious work that they are doing in researching to make sure that we understand perfectly well what we're doing. But the fact is, on a very basic level, if you do not bankerize, is now another import into the English language coming from the Latin Americans, if you do not bankerize, you probably shouldn't do it. Because if you allow yourselves to have programs where people are running around with suitcases full of money and handing it out, you're back into a politician mode and probably even more corrupt. So we have a fantastic opportunity. This is not a silver bullet, but someday I believe, especially if the bankerization works out, because I'm one of these fanatics that believes that there is such a thing as a universal basic transaction account that everyone should be able to have as a human right. It's not totally shared, I would say, but I think that the day will come. And I would just project that in 10 years, it is possible that this mechanism of transfers may underwrite the basic consumption of as many as 500 million families, and somebody will look back at it and say, well, you remember in the crisis of 2009, the trillions of dollars that they put into stimulus using the famous Keynesian arguments? That, I'm sorry, I don't know if you censor here, but I'd say, well, that was bullshit. You know what they're doing now with the 500 million families, the poorest families in the world? It's costing a small fraction of this, and it's creating a revolution at the bottom of the pyramid through their basic consumption of goods and needs, which begins to create the dynamic that we're seeing in countries such as Brazil and Mexico and other countries in Latin America who have learned this first. And now it's as donors or those in the development community, it is our goal. And having it invented in Brazil, having India at the forefront of the biometric ID, using all of the social innovations coming from the South, I think we may at long last, really have a formula which we may be empowering and eradicating poverty in a single space or in an integrated space. It'll take time. There is no magic bullet, but this may be the condition sine qua non. So I leave you with that, and I thank you for your time, and I thank the groups. Right.